The sound of gunfire split the night like thunder. Three muzzle flashes illuminated the darkness in rapid succession, revealing the weathered face of Wyatt Morgan for split seconds before plunging him back into shadow. Blood soaked his left sleeve where a bullet had torn through muscle, but he kept his Colt Army steady. Three cattle rustlers circled his position behind the upturned wagon, closing in like wolves on wounded prey. "You're dead, Morgan!" The voice belonged to a man whose face Wyatt couldn't see, but whose intentions were crystal clear. "Blackwood sends his regards." Wyatt checked his cylinder with practiced precision. 2 bullets left. 3 attackers. Bad odds for a man already losing blood. "Should have sold that worthless patch of dirt when you had the chance," another voice called from the darkness. Wyatt's finger tightened on the trigger. At 38, he'd survived Gettysburg and Apache campaigns. He wouldn't die defending a wagon full of fence posts. But the land, his land, that was different. A rustling sound came from his left. Wyatt pivoted, ready to fire, when a strange whistling cut through the air. Then another, and another. The first attacker stumbled into view, an arrow protruding from his chest, eyes wide with shock. He collapsed face first into the dirt without uttering a sound. The second man's scream was cut short by another arrow. The third fired wildly into the darkness before a third arrow found its mark. The night fell silent except for Wyatt's ragged breathing. He kept his pistol raised as 3 figures emerged from the shadows. Women, Apache women, moving with the silence of ghosts. The tallest one, with striking silver streaks in her black hair, approached without fear. Her eyes, reflecting the moonlight, studied his wound with clinical precision. The youngest one retrieved the arrows from the dead men with practiced efficiency. The third woman, who carried herself with unmistakable authority, surveyed the scene before turning her gaze to Wyatt. Not one of them spoke a word. Dawn broke over Blood Creek, Arizona Territory, 1885. Wyatt Morgan sat on his porch, watching as the 3 Apache women moved around his property with purpose. 2 days had passed since they saved his life, and still not one had spoken a single word, not to him, not to each other. His arm throbbed beneath fresh bandages, their handiwork. The one with silver-streaked hair had cleaned and dressed the wound with a mixture of herbs that smelled awful, but stopped the bleeding better than anything the town doctor might have used. 15 years of war and frontier life had carved deep lines into Wyatt's face, making him look older than his 38 years. The war between the states had given him a slight limp and nightmares that still woke him sweating. The Apache campaigns afterward had taught him respect for the warriors he fought against. He learned enough of their language to give commands and ask directions, but these women responded only with nods or gestures. He watched the youngest one. He'd started thinking of her as Kira in his mind, chopping wood with surprising strength. The middle one, Nina, was tending to his neglected vegetable garden. The silver-haired one, Elena, was nowhere to be seen. The sound of hooves drew his attention to the ridge. 3 riders approached, and Wyatt's hand instinctively moved to the Colt at his hip. He relaxed slightly when he recognized Sheriff Tanner, though the 2 men with him were strangers. "Morgan," Tanner nodded as he dismounted. "Got trouble." "Seems to find me these days," Wyatt replied, not moving from his chair. Sheriff Tanner was a decent man in an indecent job. Too old for the position at 65, but respected enough that nobody challenged him. He glanced nervously at Kira, who had stopped chopping wood and stood watching them, axe still in hand. "Word is you've got 3 Apache women here," Tanner said. "These gentlemen are from the Indian Affairs Bureau. They're looking for 3 escapees." The taller of the 2 men stepped forward. His suit was too clean for the territory, his face too soft. "Jacob Winters, Indian Affairs," he said with practiced authority. 3 female Apache escaped from the Carlisle Indian Industrial School back east. dangerous individuals, educated but unpredictable. Wyatt's face revealed nothing, though his mind raced. The Carlisle School, he'd heard stories, founded by Captain Pratt with his infamous philosophy to kill the Indian, save the man. A place where native children were stripped of their culture, their language, their very identity in the name of civilization. He glanced at Kira, who remained motionless, her expression unreadable. Nina had disappeared from the garden. "Found these ladies half dead from thirst," Wyatt said. "Don't speak a word of English. Just working to earn their keep until they move on." The second man, older and harder looking, narrowed his eyes. "Awful convenient, them showing up here, just as Maxwell Blackwood's been trying to buy your land." The name dropped like a stone into still water. Maxwell Blackwood, 55 years old, owner of the territory's largest ranch and the bank that held most of the mortgages in Blood Creek. A Union colonel during the war, the same battle where Wyatt, a Confederate captain, had taken the bullet that still ached in his leg during cold weather. "These women don't concern Blackwood," Wyatt said, his voice hardening. "Everything in this territory concerns Mr. Blackwood," the man replied with a cold smile, "especially Apache savages near his property." Wyatt's hand tightened on his gun, the walnut grip worn smooth from years of use. "My property, not his." A tension stretched between them until Sheriff Tanner cleared his throat. "Morgan, maybe you should bring these women into town. Register them proper. New territorial law says all Indians off reservation need papers." Wyatt considered this. He'd seen Elena writing in a leather-bound journal the previous night, her penmanship better than most school teachers. They were hiding something. That much was clear. "Fine," Wyatt said finally. "I'll bring them in tomorrow." As the men rode away, Elena appeared at his side, silent as always, the silver streaks in her hair gleaming in the afternoon sun. In her hands was a leather-bound book, open to a page filled with elegant script. She pointed to a passage, then to Wyatt, then made a circular motion with her finger that encompassed all three women. Wyatt frowned. "What are you trying to tell me?" For a moment he thought she might speak. Instead, she took his hand and placed it over the words on the page, then over her heart, then made a binding gesture. "You want protection?" Wyatt guessed. She nodded, her dark eyes intense. "Marriage," he said suddenly, understanding dawning. "You want me to marry you, all of you." A single solemn nod. Wyatt Morgan, who had faced Confederate charges and Apache warriors without flinching, felt a chill run down his spine. The courthouse in Blood Creek was barely more than a glorified saloon with a judge's bench. Judge Wallace Harrington, perpetually half-drunk but surprisingly fair-minded, raised his eyebrows as Wyatt entered with three Apache women in tow. "Morgan," he said, setting down a glass of amber liquid, "this is unexpected." The town had turned out for the spectacle. Businessmen, ranchers, ladies of questionable reputation, all gathered to witness whatever was about to unfold. Wyatt felt the weight of their stares as he approached the bench. "Need to register these women," he said, "and file marriage papers." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Judge Harrington blinked several times. "Marriage papers? To whom?" "To me," Wyatt said, his voice steady despite the hammering in his chest. The murmur became a roar. Someone laughed. A woman gasped dramatically. "You can't marry savages," a voice called out. Wyatt recognized Samuel Porter, Blackwood's foreman. "It's against God's law." "It's against territorial law, too," Judge Harrington said, though he looked more curious than condemning. "Unless you have special dispensation from the Indian Affairs Bureau." Elena stepped forward and handed the judge a sealed envelope, the silver streaks in her hair catching the light as she moved. Harrington opened it with a puzzled expression that slowly transformed to astonishment. These are marriage permits, signed by the territorial governor himself." He looked up, studying the women with new interest. Who exactly are these ladies, Morgan? Before Wyatt could answer, the courthouse doors burst open. Maxwell Blackwood strode in, flanked by his personal guards, men who wore their guns low and had eyes that had seen too much killing. Blackwood was tall, imposing in his tailored suit and wide-brimmed hat. A silver beard framed his face, and a watch chain gleamed across his vest. He walked like a man who owned everything his eyes fell upon. "Judge Harrington," he said, ignoring Wyatt completely, "I've received word from Washington. These Apache women are fugitives, dangerous spies who stole military documents from Carlisle before escaping." He produced an official-looking telegram. "Federal authorities want them detained immediately." Wyatt positioned himself between Blackwood and the women. "They have legal papers." "Forgeries," Blackwood said dismissively. "Clever forgeries from educated savages. The most dangerous kind." The courthouse erupted in chaos. Judge Harrington banged his gavel uselessly. Sheriff Tanner looked torn, his hand hovering near his gun. "These women saved my life," Wyatt said, his voice cutting through the noise. "They've done nothing wrong." "Then let them speak for themselves," Blackwood challenged, turning to the women. "If they're innocent, let them say so, in English." All eyes turned to the three Apache women, who stood perfectly still, their faces revealing nothing. Not one opened her mouth to speak. "You see?" Blackwood smiled triumphantly. "They can't defend themselves because they don't understand. They're exactly what I said. Dangerous fugitives hiding behind a war veteran with a soft heart." Judge Harrington looked troubled. "Morgan, if they can't speak for themselves—" "They don't need to," Wyatt interrupted. "Those papers speak for them." "Papers can be forged," Blackwood countered. "I have a witness who saw them steal military documents." He nodded to a man at the back of the room, Jacob Winters from the Indian Bureau, who stepped forward with a solemn expression. "It's true," Winters said. "They took classified documents regarding troop movements on the frontier, information that could get soldiers killed if it reaches the wrong hands." Wyatt felt the noose tightening. Elena's expression remained impassive, but her eyes never left Blackwood's face. She was studying him like a predator studies prey, the silver in her hair gleaming under the courthouse lamps. "Arrest them," Blackwood ordered. "And Morgan, too, for harboring fugitives." Sheriff Tanner hesitated. "I need more than your say-so, Blackwood." "How about the say-so of the U.S. Army?" A new voice entered the fray as Captain James Harker stepped into the courthouse, resplendent in his blue uniform. 10 soldiers followed him in, rifles at the ready. Harker was legend in the territory, an Apache hunter with 20 confirmed kills. His face bore a scar from temple to jaw, courtesy of an Apache knife. His hatred for the tribe was as famous as his tracking skills. "I have orders to detain these women and escort them to Fort Apache for questioning," Harker announced. "Anyone interfering will be arrested for obstruction." Wyatt's hand moved to his pistol. He couldn't take on 10 soldiers, but he'd go down fighting before he'd let them take these women who had saved his life. To everyone's surprise, it was the judge who intervened. "Captain, these women have legal marriage permits," Harrington said, holding up the papers. "Signed by Governor Williams himself." Harker scoffed. "Forgeries." "I've seen the governor's signature on 100 documents," Harrington countered. "These are genuine." A dangerous tension filled the room. Blackwood and Harker exchanged glances. "Judge," Blackwood said smoothly, "I respect your expertise, but national security trumps marriage permits. These women stole military secrets." "Prove it," Wyatt challenged. Blackwood smiled. "Mr. Winters, show them what you found." Winters produced a leather-bound book, identical to the ones Wyatt had seen the women writing in. "This contains copied military orders, fort locations, patrol schedules." Wyatt felt his blood run cold as Captain Harker took the book, flipping through its pages with growing anger. "This is treason," Harker declared. "Enough talk. Arrest them all." The soldiers raised their rifles. Wyatt drew his Colt in one fluid motion, thumbing back the hammer with practiced ease. 20 years after the war, he was about to die in another lost cause. Then Elena, silent, stoic Elena, with her silver-streaked hair, did something that stopped every man in his tracks. She laughed. The sound was so unexpected, so incongruous with the tension of the moment, that even the soldiers hesitated. And then she spoke, in perfect, accentless English. "Captain Harker," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence, "that journal you're holding was planted in our belongings last night by Mr. Winters here, who is not from the Indian Bureau, but is, in fact, employed by Mr. Blackwood." The courthouse froze. Jaws dropped. Women gasped. Even Wyatt couldn't hide his shock. Nina stepped forward. "If you check the handwriting against Mr. Winters' own notes, you'll find they match perfectly." Her English was as flawless as Elena's, her tone educated and precise. Kira, the youngest, addressed Blackwood directly. "We anticipated this move, Mr. Blackwood. That's why we brought our actual journals with us, the ones documenting your illegal seizure of federal mining rights, your bribing of officials, and your orchestration of accidents that conveniently allowed you to purchase neighboring ranches at a fraction of their worth." She produced 3 identical leather-bound books from beneath her traditional dress, including the mysterious fire that killed the previous owner of what is now the northern section of your ranch, a fire that started in 3 places simultaneously. Blackwood's face drained of color. Captain Harker looked between the women and Blackwood, confusion evident in his expression. "What is this?" he demanded. Elena straightened her shoulders, the silver in her hair gleaming like a crown. "My name is Elena Whitehawk, graduate of Carlisle Indian Industrial School, class of 1879, certified educator with a specialization in constitutional law. These are my colleagues, Nina Strongwater and Kira Raindance, also Carlisle graduates." She looked directly at the captain. "The Carlisle school where they taught us to abandon our heritage, cut our hair, and speak only English. Where they told us to forget our ancestors and embrace their ways. We learned their lessons well, Captain. Perhaps too well for Mr. Blackwood's comfort." She handed one of the journals to Judge Harrington. "This contains sworn testimony from witnesses to Mr. Blackwood's crimes, documented meticulously over 6 months, with dates, times, and locations. You'll find it most enlightening." "Your Honor." The judge opened the book with trembling fingers, his eyes widening as he scanned the pages. Blackwood's composure cracked. "This is absurd. They're lying savages." "We're American citizens," Kira corrected calmly, "educated at the government's expense to assimilate into white society. Ironic that we're now using that education to expose corruption within that same society." Captain Harker lowered his rifle slightly. "If what they're saying is true—" "It's not," Blackwood shouted, his carefully cultivated control evaporating. "They're manipulating you. They've bewitched Morgan, and now they're trying to destroy me." "The evidence speaks for itself," Nina said, pointing to specific passages in the journal that Judge Harrington was frantically reading. "Page 43 details the bribes paid to Territorial Secretary Collins. Page 67 outlines the falsified mineral rights claims on federal land." Blackwood's hand moved to his gun. "I won't be ruined by Apache witches." Everything happened at once. Blackwood drew his revolver, aiming not at the women, but at Wyatt. Elena moved with lightning speed, throwing herself into the path of the bullet. The gunshot echoed through the courthouse as she fell. Wyatt's Colt barked 3 times in rapid succession. Despite his wounded arm, his aim was true, the product of years of war and survival. His first shot caught Blackwood in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around. The second punched through his chest. The third hit him squarely between the eyes. Blackwood staggered backward, his expression one of utter disbelief as he collapsed to the floor. Chaos erupted. Blackwood's men drew their weapons. Captain Harker's soldiers raised their rifles. Sheriff Tanner fired into the ceiling, bellowing for order that would not come. The courthouse became a storm of gunfire and shouting. Two of Blackwood's men fell to military rifles. Another was taken down by Wyatt's deadly accuracy with his Colt. The remaining gunmen surrendered, throwing their weapons to the floor as the soldiers surrounded them. Throughout the gunfight, Wyatt had shielded Elena with his body, dragging her behind the judge's bench for cover. Now, as the smoke cleared, he knelt beside her, cradling her head. Blood soaked through her dress where Blackwood's bullet had struck her shoulder, staining the silver streaks in her hair crimson. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Why take that bullet?" Her dark eyes met his, pain evident, but clarity still there. "Because you were worth saving," she whispered, "just as you once saved my brother at White Rock Creek." Recognition dawned in Wyatt's eyes. "The Apache boy, during the campaign. That was your brother?" She nodded weakly. "We've been watching you for a long time, Wyatt Morgan, a man with honor in a land that has forgotten its meaning." Around them, the gunfire had stopped. Captain Harker stood over Blackwood's body, his expression grim. Judge Harrington was shouting for a doctor. Sheriff Tanner had Blackwood's remaining men disarmed and against the wall. Kira knelt beside Wyatt, pressing a cloth to Elena's wound. "The bullet passed through clean," she said. "She'll live." "You planned all of this," Wyatt said, understanding finally dawning. "You chose me deliberately." Nina joined them, her eyes on the soldiers, who were now reading through the journals with growing alarm. "We needed a man with land, courage, and a conscience. Someone Blackwood couldn't buy or intimidate. Someone who would stand against injustice, even for Apache women." "We didn't plan on caring about you," Elena added softly, reaching up to touch his face with blood-stained fingers. "That part happened on its own." 1 month later, Wyatt Morgan stood on his porch, watching the sun set over land that was undeniably his. The wound in his arm had healed to a puckered scar, another badge from a life of struggle. Elena sat beside him, her shoulder still bandaged but healing well, the silver streaks in her hair now complemented by intricate Apache beadwork she had begun wearing again. At the edge of the property, Nina was teaching a group of children, some white from town, some Apache from nearby, how to plant crops using techniques she'd learned at Carlisle and from her ancestors. Kira had returned from the territorial capital with Captain Harker, who had undergone a transformation of his own. The evidence against Blackwood had been overwhelming, revealing a criminal enterprise that had corrupted officials throughout the territory. Harker, realizing he had been manipulated, had become an unlikely ally. "They're calling you a hero in town," Elena said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "They're calling you something worse," Wyatt replied, but there was no heat in his words. "They'll adapt," she said confidently. "People always do when faced with truth they can't deny." The investigation had revealed the full extent of Blackwood's crimes, dozens of forged documents, bribed officials, and at least 3 murders disguised as accidents. His land empire was being divided among those he had wronged, with Wyatt's property secure not just for him, but for his Apache wives. The marriage permits had indeed been genuine, arranged months before Elena, Nina, and Kira had ever approached Wyatt. They had researched him thoroughly, identified him as their best hope against Blackwood, and orchestrated their rescue of him during the cattle rustling incident. "Was anything real?" he had asked Elena during her recovery. "The bullet I took for you was real," she had answered, her fingers tracing the silver streaks in her hair, a legacy of trauma from her years at Carlisle, where she had aged beyond her 30 years. "And what I feel now is real." The town of Blood Creek was changing. With Blackwood's corrupt influence removed, honest businesses were thriving. The schoolhouse that had once barred Apache children now welcomed them, with Nina serving as assistant teacher. The church that had preached against mixing races now held services where all were welcome. Not everyone approved. There were still whispers, sidelong glances, and occasional threats. But the sight of Wyatt Morgan's hand resting on his Colt was usually enough to silence the most vocal critics. A rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast toward the ranch. Wyatt's hand moved instinctively to his gun. Federal Marshal Elena identified the approaching figure, probably with news about the trials. The remaining conspirators in Blackwood's organization were facing justice, one by one. Each conviction reinforced the new order in Blood Creek, one where the law applied equally to all. Wyatt nodded but didn't relax his vigilance. He had learned that peace was always temporary in this territory, just like silence could hide the most powerful voices. Sometimes, he said, watching the rider approach, the strongest voice comes from where you least expect it. Elena's hand found his, warm and certain. And sometimes, she replied, a man who thinks he's fighting his last battle is actually fighting his first important one. In the distance, the rider raised his hand in greeting, and Wyatt returned the gesture. Whatever came next, he would face it standing tall, no longer alone in a land that demanded everything from a man, but still gave back just enough to make the fight worthwhile. Behind them, Nina called the children in for the evening meal. Kira emerged from the barn, where she had been organizing a community meeting for the following day. The ranch house that had once stood empty and silent now buzzed with purpose and life. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire. Wyatt looked at the three women who had turned his solitary existence upside down. Women who had risked everything to fight injustice with the very tools their oppressors had given them. They had come to him in silence, but their voices, when finally heard, had changed everything. And somewhere in a town several days' ride away, a stranger was asking questions about the rancher who had married three Apache women. A stranger who carried a folded wanted poster with 4 names written in bold black ink. A stranger whose arrival would soon test whether the fragile peace in Blood Creek could endure. But that was tomorrow's battle. Tonight, Wyatt Morgan sat with his family, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast Arizona sky, his hand never straying far from his Colt, just in case.